Go ahead and get started. But
Love it.
if that's okay with you, Dr. Ibrahim?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, fantastic. So on behalf of Michigan Journal of Medicine and medical student grand rounds, welcome everyone. I wanted to take a second to introduce our speaker, Dr. Ibrahim. So Dr. Ibrahim is an assistant professor of surgery at the University of Michigan, practicing general surgery at the Ann Arbor VA. He's also faculty at the Topel College of Architecture and Urban Planning. His research encompasses the interface of healthcare delivery, policy evaluation, and architecture, and has resulted in features in Fast Company and Wired. He is on the editorial board at Annals of Surgery, where he founded the Visual Abstract, which is a novel visual technique to disseminate research now used by over 75 academic journals and institutions around the world. He has also previously given MJM a fantastic talk about that. He currently directs the University of Michigan Department of Surgery, Health and Design Fellowship. He's a chief medical officer at HOK, which is a global design and architecture firm. In addition to these accomplishments, he serves as VA clerkship director for those of you that do a gen surge rotation at the VA, where you might be lucky enough to hear his fantastic talk on perioperative fluids. And last time I was in the OR with him, he casually dropped, hopefully I remember this correctly, that his favorite architecture project was working on a design for a carless city in Singapore. So today he'll be talking with us about both leading a journal club and manuscript writing. And I request for those of you that are able, if you can turn your cameras on, that would be fantastic. So with that, thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim, and I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Morgan. Well, good to hang out with you guys. I feel like 5 p.m., well, 6 p.m. in med school time, that's like coveted witching hours. You're either like super exhausted because you got up at like 3 a.m, you're like about to go into work later today, or there's like a ton of reading you haven't started yet that you have to do and you're procrastinating. So anyway, thanks for giving me like coveted hour of your time. I used to think journal clubs were like, oh, can I get some screen sharing ability, Morgan?
Give me 1 second. Sorry about that.
I used to think journal clubs were like not that cool because I usually used to go to the journal clubs for like the free food and I hadn't read anything, which is like kind of hard to like get a lot out of journal club. But then I became like the person who had to like run journal club. And I realized that like a lot of people were actually very similar, who were also kind of there for the food and like didn't also read the articles. So I thought what I would do is to kind of give you some life hacks on like how to run a journal club that gets like the most out of the time and the people. And it implicitly gives you kind of instructions on how to be a better writer, which I think will be cool for a lot of you. And then we'll probably end early and we can geek about whatever you guys want to talk about. So with that, how to journal club, I will preface by saying, as Morgan alluded to, I'm like a pretty ambitious person like the rest of us. If you're in this group putting like discretionary time into a talk, you're probably super motivated, ambitious. I love operating, I love doing research, but you just got to make sure you take some time for yourself. This is definitely a marathon and not a sprint. So take some time to go to live concerts whenever those open up again, or go hiking or whatever. Just be kind to yourself because this is a pretty long career, no matter what field you go into. And don't lose sight of kind of all the shiny objects that we all chase. So why journal club? I think there's like a lot of reasons why journal clubs exist. And I think part of it is just to think about like big ideas. Like if you're in an academic environment, you're probably like a nerd who's just like trying to think about big problems. And journal club is like a great forum to help you start to do that. It's also to geek about like writing and methods. So sometimes we journal club. This is pre-COVID, our health services research group called CHOP, Center for Healthcare Outcomes and Policy. This is Friday at 4 p.m. and this room is packed because it's a high level discussion about like, how did someone write their article so well? Or like, what are these methods they use that were just like so interesting that like maybe really relevant to the stuff I'm trying to do. Like this really gives me insight and allows me to kind of bond with some of my peers around that. And I think probably most directly is it informs clinical problems. As you will see, I remember when I was a medical student and you would watch attendings make decisions, you thought like, Jesus, like once you're an attending, you know, like everything. Like they always seem to have an answer. It turns out like that's not true. And maybe we're just good at like disguising it or bluffing well, or have just seen the problem before. But a lot of the problems we see in clinical medicine, the answers change or evolve. And a really important role of Journal Club is to help you kind of tackle some of these important problems, especially as the evidence changes. So at some point in your life, you may be tasked with the awesome project of running a journal club. And I want to give you like some sort of keys to success or some frameworks to think about it that hopefully will make you a little more successful in doing that. And I realize because it's like an evening talk and it's hard to focus, there's definitely like 10 random pictures of my dog just interspersed like every 5th or 6th slide. So that's Bear, typically sleeps by the door on my shoes. So like you literally can't leave the house either without your shoes or like without him. He's definitely got tabs on what's going on. All right, so first thing you need to do is like choose articles. And ideally you want to choose things that are like timely or like particularly interesting. If you think about like how many research articles exist in like the world, like just came out this week, it's like a lot. So if you're going to get people's time for an hour to sit and think about something, you got to choose the right articles. And I think it's kind of important to know how that happens. And I'll show you that. Then you need like a good presenter, and I'll give you some tricks to kind of like be good at that. And then finally, you got to get the right people together. You may have great articles and a great person, but man, if it's like the wrong audience in the wrong room, it's totally going to fall flat. So let me kind of take those like one at a time and tell you a little bit how to think about that and sort of how to orient being successful. So when you think about articles to choose, I think most articles that we think about kind of fall into a couple categories. There are ones that are broad appeal narratives, and that's in your like New England Journal, JAMA's Health Affairs, that are like these big ticket topics like the Affordable Care Act, or like a new payment incentive, or like a new drug that gets discovered that's widely applicable. Those are broad appeal. Then there's like specialty focused narratives. These are like your specialty journals, like the Annals of Surgical Oncology, like really specific audiences. And then kind of separate from sort of the audience, there's also another axis of like, how compelling is the data? Is this like limited data, but just a really compelling hypothesis? And it's like a really innovative theoretical idea? Or is this like the end result of a huge randomized trial and you have really solid data? So when you start to put those together, certain journals kind of fall into different categories. So if you're looking for kind of broad appeal and high impact data, the New England Journal, JAMA Health Affairs kind of fall in that window. And that's probably if you're thinking about audiences that are like a mixed group, like a broad cohort of medical students. When you start moving over towards like specialty journals, every field has them. I just included the surgical ones because that's my field that I knew. But you're still in like robust data, but you're now in like a much more kind of niche topic. And then when you get to limited data, you probably don't use these as much in Journal Club, but there's kind of like the newspaper op-eds where people have written really thoughtfully about a mainstream health topic. And then there's like the viewpoints and perspectives that are in a lot of our journals, and they're kind of like usually like an expert opinion. I'd say most journal clubs kind of tend to be in the top half, and it tends to go based on kind of the narrative of the audience you're trying to go for. Probably one of the most important things in choosing a good article is one that's well written. So if you haven't read Ruth Bader Ginsburg's memoirs, highly recommend. It's good for a lot of reasons, but she actually gives her advice on writing. And this is something that she is quoted saying multiple times when she would have new clerks rotate with her in the Supreme Court. She said, I'd prefer and continue to aim for opinions that both get it right and keep it tight without undue digressions and decorations. And she famously would have opinions that were significantly shorter than everybody else's. And it turns out in academic medicine and writing, most of the mainstream journals have actually gone towards shorter word limits to kind of force you to get to like the point sooner. And if you're going to have people read 2 or 3 articles for a journal club, I think choosing articles that are well written and on the shorter side is definitely in your favor. When you're thinking about it, you want to think of things that are like timely. And so I personally, like, post-election season kind of disconnected from cable news because it was just like bringing me down. But you still kind of want to keep in line with like, what are people talking about? What do people care about? Like if you've been listening to any podcast in the last month, everything is about climate change. Like the UN just put out a huge report about the impact of climate change. 200 medical journals just wrote a consensus op-ed on the impacts of climate change and health. Like that is a mainstream relevant topic. And you can go to PubMed now and look up climate change and like your topic, and you'll find a handful of really good articles that'll be kind of like relevant to people now. So there's Bear again. That's baby Bear, and that's like 4-month Bear. Still has the same foot swagger. So Bear unfortunately can't be like presenting the articles for you, but you want to think about like getting someone to present who is engaged and cares about the work. And I think one of the most like gut-wrenching feelings when you're running a journal club is you realize that like nobody read the article. And it's not that like people don't want to, but like people get busy, everyone's time's crunched. So they show up at this like dinner for an hour with these printed off articles in their hand and like no one's read it. So I've tried to think a little bit about like, how do you sort of like circumvent that? One is that like, you're gonna give a summary of the article at the beginning. So the presenter, whoever it is, it could be you, someone you select, they're gonna answer a handful of basic questions about the article. And the first is gonna be like, why is the topic important? Like they gotta get everyone up to speed about just the nuts and bolts of the topic, kind of assuming no one's read it. How did they do the research? How do the researchers evaluate that question? What did they find? And like, who cares? And like, why does it matter? So to like dive into that a little deeper, I want to sidetrack a little bit to talk about writing a research article. And I think one of the things about research articles is they're essentially written the same way every time. Kind of like you might hear in the hospital, especially in the operating room, like we do it the same way every time for a reason. Turns out research articles follow kind of a similar convention, and it's almost in this order. But there's a couple of sections I want to point out that are like particularly relevant to you in kind of journal club land. So when you're trying to think about like, what is like important about this article, like why does it matter? The introduction definitely sets the tone for like who cares about this topic, and the first paragraph of the discussion. Tried and true, if you write to the right format, that always kind of gives you like the punchlines. So let me tell you a little bit more about like the abstract and why people obsess about it so much, and why like you should care about it and what it typically does. So an introduction almost always has 3 paragraphs. And the first paragraph is getting the reader up to speed to just be like, what is important about this? So like, what about the Affordable Care Act? Like, when was it initiated? What did it cover? And what were its like key features? The next thing a good introduction does in the next paragraph is it creates knowledge gaps. Like what's known and what's unknown. Like what's already been described on this topic and what are kind of like the lingering questions. And then the third paragraph should set up why the paper is going to help fill a couple of those knowledge gaps. So if our introduction is written well, and in those mainstream journals they will be, it'll almost always follow this convention. So you very quickly in your journal club can get people up to speed. Like, here's the punchline, here's like what's known and unknown, and like, here's how this paper tried to go about it. So I'll give you just an example from a paper that I wrote as one of my kind of first research papers when I got to Michigan. It was about critical access hospitals. It's probably something like none of you have ever heard of. And I kind of assumed when I wrote this that nobody had heard of it. But in like 3 sentences, I could get you up to speed pretty quickly. So critical access hospital designations help ensure that more than 59 million people who live in rural areas have access to care. Established by the government in the late 90s. And there's been a lot of debate about whether or not these hospitals provide better or worse care. And the purpose of this study was to figure out like whether or not that's true for surgical patients. So like in a nicely written introduction, you kind of know this 3-paragraph hack. You can quickly kind of tease out like what this is about. In the next methods section, it's kind of looking at what they did. And what you want to do here as the presenter, there's going to be a lot of methods that like people don't know. And like the worst thing you can do is just throw like a bunch of jargon at them. And so your goal when you're explaining this is to make your audience feel smarter at the end of your explanation. So don't use a bunch of big words to like sound smart, like just break it down in plain language and help people get access to it. So for example, let's say that research study used, a hierarchical model to partition variance to understand where the source of variation came from. That sounds like pretty complicated and obnoxious, but if you were running a journal club and that was the methods they use, then just take 2 seconds and say, hey, think about like, if you were trying to understand like what students in medical school get the best grades, well, part of it, you could look at like the individual students and their performance. Part of it, you could look at like what small groups they were in. And then part of it probably has to do like what med school they're in. And you can actually separate by levels and group people at different levels and then tease out like where do the differences in scores happen. And even if you just took like a minute to give like a lay, common, clear explanation of the methods, it'll help people get so much more out of the article. And then you can kind of move back to like the more specifics of it in like a healthcare context. This is Bear running around illegally at Bird Hill off leash, but he has good recall and he hasn't attacked anyone. So I feel like pretty good about it. He's also like 12 pounds. Next is the results section. Do you guys know, do they still use this book in medical school, Bates Guide to Physical Exam? This was like some crazy rite of passage when I went to medical school that you had to spend like $100 to like buy this book that told you how to like report a physical exam. I think most of us read like 2 chapters and then like put it in our locker. But one of the take home points of it was like when you're describing a physical exam, you should just describe what you see and not like editorialize or interpret. And that's exactly what the results section of a research article should do. So the results section of a research article, both when you're writing it and kind of reporting it for a journal club, should not say things like, much to our surprise, the results shockingly demonstrate no difference between groups A and B. Like, that's way too much interpretation here. All you want to say is like, there is no difference in outcomes between groups A and B, and these are like the numbers in table 3. And just like plainly state it. It kind of like helps keep your credibility objectively, but sort of like keep things in order. And this really answers that question of like, what did they find? And then finally, the discussion article of a good paper that you're going to write one day, some of you, is almost always written in the same order. So the first paragraph of a discussion should summarize the key findings of the study. So if you think about the research article to this point, there's an abstract, an introduction, methods, and results. You may have written 1,500, 2,000 words already. That's like a lot for a reader. And so when you get to a discussion, you almost have to like regroup and be like, look, this study was designed for this reason, to get people up to speed kind of on this topic. So I sometimes, if I read like the abstract of an article and I like don't know what they're talking about, I like go here next as like, this is the plain language summary of what they tried to do. So this is from that same paper I showed you earlier. That's like the plain summary of this paper. This study had two principal findings regarding how surgical care is delivered at critical access hospitals. First, it had no difference in 30-day mortality. Second, there's no evidence of higher expenditures for these common procedures. Taken together, these findings kind of challenge our previous ideas about care in this environment. And so I think it's a good hack to know, both for you as a writer, like what is the expectation of what you're supposed to put in that section of the article, but also like for journal club reasons, like you can direct readers here as like, here's the plain language take home points of the article if it's not clear kind of in the other places. After that paragraph, the next one or two paragraphs should always put the research like into context and kind of explain what are the other papers that tried to answer this question and how is this similar or different, and what is this paper kind of adding to that debate or controversy. The next paragraph is totally my favorite, and I would say medical students are disproportionately exceptional at this section, because you have to talk about your limitations, but still make yourself look good. So the classic when you're like interviewing for med school is they're like, what's like a weakness you have? And you're like, well, one of my weaknesses is that like, I just like love to do everything. And I'm just like so motivated that I get like 100 projects done at a time. But I've learned to like prioritize them and make sure I do like the most important ones first. It's kind of like making it sound like you have a weakness, but you're sort of downplaying why it's a major weakness. You want to do that in your research article to be honest about like the limitations of your research, because no one knows it as well as you do, but you want to try to say something about how you sort of tried to mitigate that. So let me show you a couple examples from like that same paper. There's always a paragraph that says something like, this study should be interpreted in the context of certain limitations. And one limitation that we have a ton in our research group is we use administrative claims data, which is basically like billing data that we extract clinical outcomes from. And so people would often complain like, that's not clinically valid. But in the sentence right after, I just tell you, to minimize any coding biases of billing data, we selected codes that are specifically demonstrated to not be sensitive to that bias. So in a way, you're kind of like saying like, here's a limitation I know you want to ding me on, and like, here's what I tried to do to make it not that big of a deal. And it's like a good section. Like if you show up to Journal Club and you haven't like read the article that closely, and they're like, Morgan, do you have any criticisms of this article? You can like quickly ninja to the second last paragraph of the manuscript and be like, actually, there are probably 3 major limitations that we should be thinking about in the context of this study. Like 1, they used administrative data. I'm not sure about that. 2, looks like it's highlighted here. It looks like their study population may not be generalizable. And all of a sudden, you just have like a little bit of a way to keep your bearings straight about discussing the article, even if you haven't like fully read the whole thing or known. And in good manuscripts, the limitation section is always like second to the end. It's always right before the conclusion. And so it's like a good hack, both for you as a writer to know about, like that's where I need to put it and where people are looking for it, but also you for Journal Club land to kind of know how to find that. And then finally, this is probably like the most fun paragraph at the end, is like, so what? Like, what do you want to do moving forward? And this is probably where authors get to editorialize a little bit. So if you wrote some great paper talking about, climate change and the impacts of climate change on health, and you demonstrate this really compelling outcome association, this is your chance to like tell people like, so what? Like, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to change the way climate regulations are done? Do you want healthcare providers to be stakeholders at the UN forums on climate cutoff hazard ratios? Like, what do you want people to do now that they've read this ratio? And I think in journal clubs, this probably becomes like the most fun or interesting part of journal club of like, what are we going to do about this article? Like, are we really going to change our practice, or are we going to think differently kind of about this space? So in this particular article, it was about this payment incentive. So we just like explicitly said, like, maintaining these payment policies could be incredibly important for rural populations to maintain access to common procedures. And so it just like really kind of quickly gets you to the punchline. All right, the next is like getting the right crowd to come to journal club. So if you just invite like a bunch of randoms, there is like a low probability that they're all going to have an interest in the thing that you have selected to talk about. And so you got to be thoughtful about like who you're attracting to journal club. And then you ideally want to bring some content experts who can like really speak thoughtfully about it. So one way to do that is there are these things called visual abstracts that I'm a huge fan of and kind of helped develop like 5 years ago. But everybody, most journals use them now. So this is one from the New England Journal. And I think about like when I advertise a journal club, I often advertise it with the visual abstract because in like 60 seconds, you can get the main punchline that this is a randomized trial for glioblastoma comparing dual versus monotherapy, and the median overall survival was no different between the two groups. You don't have to be like an expert on the topic now, but you at least know like the punchline and kind of the relevant details of the study. And I think one thing that's valuable about using that to advertise the journal club is someone will read that pretty quickly and be like, yeah, I want to go talk about that topic, or like, that's of no interest to me and I'm not going to waste my time, even if there is free pizza involved. But also for the person who like maybe didn't read the article or didn't read it closely, this at least gets them up to speed on the nuts and bolts of the article. That kind of makes it easier to engage in the work. This is another visual abstract that was super popular. It was a survey of 1,000 surgeons about kind of their barriers to becoming surgical scientists. Those are like the top 3 reasons discussed. Like you could imagine putting this slide up at a journal club, and I bet you could get a group of surgeons and med students to talk for like an hour about like the implications of these barriers to becoming surgical scientists. So I think it's like a cool hack to have in your back pocket that like for a lot of articles now, these visual summaries exist that can kind of get everybody up to speed to make the discussion a little more robust. And the next thing you want to do is you want to get some content experts. So I don't know if you know about this database, but there's like a Michigan research expert database where you can look up like any topic and they'll tell you who the experts on campus are for that. So I just like quickly searched COVID. And I don't know if you guys know Preeti Milani. She's the chief health officer for the whole University of Michigan. But she's also a former associate editor at JAMA. She is on the news like almost every day talking about COVID, its implications, guidelines, opening schools, not opening. And she's like right here at Michigan. So like if you're gonna have a journal club about COVID, it would be incredible. Like one, you find an article that's relevant mainstream. 2, it has like a visual abstract so you can engage people who might have like a discretionary interest in it, who may not read the full text of your email or the article. And then 3, you have like a legit next level content expert, like sitting in your backyard. And I would say like 95% of the time, especially as like students, if you tell a faculty, hey, we really admire your work, we really want to discuss something that we know you're an expert in, could you come hang out with us for an hour and give us your 2 cents? Like most faculty would love to do it. And I think the key to that is sort of just recognizing that like there's a way to identify these people like literally in our backyard. So summary, we're kind of like hitting the home stretch. You're going to find the right articles that ideally are kind of timely, interesting. You're going to be a fun presenter by kind of knowing some of these hacks of like where the key information is and kind of using visual abstracts to your advantage. And then finally, getting the right crowd of people, both from kind of the audience side, but also from the expert side. That'll help make you more successful. So that I'll say go blue, and I'll leave this up to take questions. And we finished a little early. It's a little later in the day, but I'm happy to geek out about anything you guys want. Journal club, article writing, or like med school life in general, whatever would be helpful to you.
Hi, Dr. Ibrahim. Thanks for being here.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. I'm outside. I'm doing the heart health.
Dude,
Well,
you're being good to yourself. I love it.
Yeah, I was like hitting the first slide, being kind to myself. I had a question because of your interest in design and health and how like the setup of a space influences how people interact and like collaborate in an environment. If we have in-person journal clubs, how do you suggest setting up the space?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I definitely would not use like an auditorium. So it's pretty important in journal club that you kind of want to like democratize the platform and who gets to speak. And so whatever you can do to not have like a center stage and not have like a center chair. Like often journal clubs, when we used to do them at our houses, we would give like the visiting expert the like grand armchair in the corner, and people kind of like circled up around like the sage. And that's probably like the worst way to do it actually, because it creates this uncomfortable deference about who should speak in what turn. So ideally it should be almost like an evenly distributed non-hierarchical format where there is clearly somebody who's like leading it. But it should be the case that like anybody should be able to speak up and they have kind of like equal representation in the room. Design question. I didn't see that coming. That was a little curveball.
Well, yeah, I was trying to incorporate your interests. And like, I guess I'm trying to think if we have desks in a space, I don't know, because I always had learned that you never want to have furniture like in front of you when you're presenting, like don't be upstaged by a piece of furniture. So in a journal club, do you think it influences interactions with folks if they're sitting at chairs with nothing in front of them in a circle, or if they have desks in front of them and then in a circle? Just with
I think in a perfect world, most people come with the article, and in perfect world, they've like read it and marked it up and have it like in front of them because they're already geek about it. I've experimented with like literally printing out the visual abstracts and giving them to the people right at the beginning of journal club. So then like, even if they like didn't read it, they have like a little prop to stand on that gives them like the main gist of what's about to be discussed. I don't have strong feelings about furniture per se, but I think making sure people have like the content that gives them a little cheat sheet to stay engaged in the discussion. Because if you think about it, let's just say it's a topic like opioids, which is like a huge research interest here at Michigan. We have tons of experts, tons of papers about it. I would bet that like most students who show up to a journal club on opioids have like some discretionary feelings or thoughts or opinions about the way we use them, how we could be using them better. And I think you silence voices if you don't give them like an entry-level way to comment and engage. And so making sure people kind of have at least the rudimentary framework for it is kind of essential. Cecilia from the chat. Do you have any tips for putting methods into layperson's terms effectively? I really appreciate when facilitators do this well. I think it can be hard. Holy smoke, Cecilia, you win like 1,000 points. I don't know who you are, but like 1,000 points. So I actually think that's what you should do when you're writing the article too. Like forget journal club. Like when you're writing the article, your writing should be as accessible as possible. And the way I think about writing the methods in a really clear fashion. And if you look at any of the research articles from like my research group or any of us in the Department of Surgery who do like health services research group, we often write in almost like a chronologic order of our thought process. So we often write something like, the overall goal of this analysis was to compare surgical outcomes at critical access versus non-critical access hospitals. First, we identified which hospitals were critical access and which ones weren't using these codes in this data set. Next, we pulled these key features of the hospitals. Then once we had those two, we looked at these patient outcomes. And then finally, we compared those outcomes using these analytic models. We try to like write it in order, but in like really accessible lay terms. So that ideally like should be the case. I often, if it's a method that I don't know, I know it sounds like a little lame, but I honestly just Google it and try to look for like a short video or like an infographic, kind of like I did for that hierarchical model, which is really just like classroom scores of students and like where's the variation happen. And so I think being able to find kind of lay examples, and I think it's also a opportunity to take advantage of your expert. So if you bring in a content expert whose life's work is that topic, they hopefully should be able to break it down in a way that's like super accessible without getting stuck like way in the weeds. And so I think those are two kind of good hacks to help make the methods more accessible. I will just tell you, when I was in medical school, I wasn't like a great student, to be perfectly honest. Like I failed my boards. People told me you're not gonna like go into surgical residency. I didn't have the greatest track record. And I sort of realized I was just trying to keep up with people and like not focusing on learning. So what I used to do was when I'd get like the syllabus for like what we had to learn that week, I would try to read about it. And if I didn't know, I would actually just go Google stuff and try to read like the patient education page on like that topic just to get like a lay person's understanding. And then I kind of layered in the deeper stuff later. And so I think using that to your advantage, trying to explain some of these methods can be useful for Journal Club, but also potentially for your medical education as well. Anuj Patel, what is your opinion on really busy tables that contain a lot of content, but not really relevant to the body of the manuscript versus making figures or sticking it in the supplemental section? Dude, supplemental section is like the best hidden secret of academic writing in the world. So there's kind of like two things about it. One is you often do a lot of work to come up with these models, and your table often reflects like a lot of work. And so you want to not like sell yourself short, but you definitely want to stick to the things that are relevant. So what I often do in my tables is I, in the body of the manuscript, will describe the overall pattern in the table. So I will say across multiple outcomes, critical access hospitals had worse outcomes than non-critical access hospitals, period. And then like table 3, then I'd say, for example, 30-day mortality was 15% versus 12% at critical access versus non-critical access. And so I think certainly the things in your table should be relevant, but when you're explaining it in the manuscript, I try to describe like the overall pattern and then give like one example. And I think one like related hack to that is you definitely want to have like some clarity. So it may be the case that like in your data, you pulled like 20 outcomes that you think are fascinating, but geez, some go this way, some go that way. Some are all part of this exposure, some are different exposure. You may need to like split that into 2 different papers and just say like, for this paper, I'm going to focus on like these 5 outcomes that are telling a little bit more of a consistent story that you could explain a little bit more clearly and tell the patterns more clearly. So I think it's both a product of staying relevant, but also sometimes like cutting out stuff and moving it to a different paper or not at all, kind of for the sake of clarity. And I think a lot of us are uncomfortable doing that because like you want to show how hard you work. So you're like, more, more, more. But if any of you have rotated on a surgical service and presented in the morning, you know that more is not better. It's actually often worse. And so your ability to be clear and concise is like super valuable. Cameron Harder wants to know, when you spoke about choosing pertinent, interesting articles for Journal Club, what are the best ways to choose articles? Do you subscribe to a bunch of articles? If so, how do you filter out articles where there's so much research being produced? Apologies, you just right now. Let me give you a couple straightforward answers and then like some kind of lame ones, but I'm not going to be apologetic about Twitter, so I'm just going to go for it. You definitely can sort of like just look at like the mainstream news headlines and then start to search those keywords like in PubMed and be like, what are people writing on that topic? I think the other thing that I do is I have key journals that I read that are my interest. So I think a lot about architecture, built environment, and health policy. So I usually scan the health table of contents from a journal like Health Affairs, which is like very health policy relevant. I often look at the table of contents of a New England Journal or JAMA because they're like a high level generalist audience, which relates to a lot of my work. And I think part of it relates to like who your audience is. Like if you're going to give a journal club at like the cardiology student interest group, or like everyone there wants to go into cardiology, then I'd probably look at like the top cardiology journal. And I'd probably look at one of those mainstream journals like New England Journal or JAMA and look at like what were the 3 or 4 most recent articles on like a cardiology topic. And I think that helps you. And then finally, I think Twitter gets a bad rap in part because of like our last political cycle, but Twitter can be something that you curate to filter and find the information that you're looking for. And so on Twitter, I follow a bunch of architects that I look up to and admire, who I think talk about important things. I follow a bunch of health policy researchers, and I follow a couple mainstream researchers, and often they will bring up important articles that just got released. So like a good example, maybe I'll just pull them up and we can see if I like eat my words or if this turns out to be like a good idea. But there's a cardiologist named Eric Topel who is definitely like a mainstream voice in a lot of conversations around health, but he does something that's like pretty exceptional. So I'm going to share screen again and kind of show you. I just like shared the screen of us. That's not going to get us very far. Eric Topel does this remarkable thing where he reads articles that he thinks are interesting. And when he shares them, he actually highlights the things that he thinks are important about the article. So he'll look at this New England Journal article, and he's already gone through, he's giving you kind of the punchline, reassuring data on vaccination preventing transmission from over 144,000 healthcare workers and 104 healthcare. And then he went through the article and highlighted like the key points. So he's like a serious thought leader. And this is like something he does like a lot of, like a key figure, a key article. When there's a key article in length, he highlights kind of like the key quote or the key punchline. So I had a research article come out like 3 months ago that he did that for my article, and I was like totally floored. And someone just texted me and they were like, you just got Topeled. And I had no idea what they were talking about. But like I knew Eric Topel did this thing. I just didn't realize it was a verb. But my point is like if you go to something like Twitter, social media, you can follow thought leaders in the topic that you're interested in. So there's definitely a lot of people on Twitter in the medical education space who opine a lot about the new match protocol, like whether or not step 1 score pass fail is like a good or bad thing. Or apparently this upcoming year in surgery, they're going to do this like preference sensitive thing where you basically can tell programs that like they're in your like top 5 and you're like into them. It's kind of like awkwardly dating and like telling like that person's best friend that like you want to ask that person out. So like I didn't even know about that. I only knew about it because I saw it on Twitter, and I saw someone who I look up to and respect in the med ed space kind of like tweet and write about it. So I think social media can actually be like a helpful way to identify some relevant contents if you're following the right people. Like I would not probably follow like Drake and Kanye West to choose like your next journal club article. Like you might follow them anyway for different reasons, but like for journal club article selection, like maybe not. All right, time's winding down. I'll entertain one more question, and then you're free to go outside and enjoy the weather before it turns crappy and cold tonight.
If nobody else has a question, I did have a question for you.
Yeah.
So in terms of like when you're presenting, you want to get some background on the article, usually like beyond like reading the article itself. And usually I think when you are leading a journal club, you find yourself in usually one of 2 camps. You're either like already pretty in field and you kind of know like the context around it and like what the main controversies might be. Or I think as medical students, a lot of times we find ourselves like not in field and we're trying to introduce ourselves to the field. So when you're in that situation where you're not in field, how do you suggest to sort of prepare for those like high yield context points of contrast?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think part of it for yourself as like the presenter, if it's not your expertise, your comfort area, then you kind of got to like lean into a mentor who that is their content expertise and be like, hey, here's what I think the key points of this article are and how I'd explain them. Like, does that make sense? And pre-baking that. And then I think kind of knowing your audience a little bit, I would kind of go into most journal clubs, assuming that most people haven't read it or don't know a lot of the details, and just take those 5 minutes up front to hand out the visual abstract and to go over the nuts and bolts of the article, including explaining some of the methods. I think you'll almost never go wrong assuming people know less and getting them up to speed. And if you're one of those people, then it's probably like a meeting with your mentor or expert like a week before to help them kind of get you up to speed. It sounds like a little redundant, but truthfully, having done a lot of journal clubs, like that little bit extra of prep time goes like an enormous long way to like making the whole thing more effective. All right, you guys have been very patient and engaged and kind. I appreciate you taking an hour of like discretionary med school summer warm evening time to hang out. If I can be of any help to any of you, feel free to reach out to me by email.